If you came here because of that black monster with the blower sticking through the hood, don't worry, we're getting to exactly what made it so legendary. But here's something most people never realize about the Mad Max Interceptor. The reason this car feels so powerful on screen isn't just because of the way it looks. It's because buried under all that movie magic is an engine that represents the final days of an entire era. The story of the Interceptor is really the story of one of Ford's greatest V8s and the slow death of the classic muscle car. By the time the car appeared on movie screens, the world it represented was already disappearing. And that's exactly why it became unforgettable. When most people think of the Mad Max Pursuit Special, they picture the aggressive nose and the flat black paint. It looks less like a car and more like something built to survive the end of civilization. Over the years, many fans have assumed it was some kind of American muscle car because of its appearance. It certainly has that attitude. But the truth is a little different. The famous Pursuit Special actually began life in Australia as a 1973 Ford Falcon XB GT hardtop. The car was purchased at an auction in Frankston, Victoria, along with 2 other Falcon coupes. The price for all 3 cars was less than $20,000. Before becoming a movie icon, the Falcon was originally painted polar white and had been ordered through Rural Motors in Orange, New South Wales. Back then, nobody could have imagined that this ordinary Australian performance car would eventually become one of the most recognizable vehicles in movie history. What made the XB GT such a perfect candidate for transformation was that it already looked tough straight from the factory. It had a long hood that seemed to stretch forever, a sleek fastback roofline, and a wide planted stance that gave it real presence on the road. Even before any modifications were made, it looked like a machine built for speed and authority. It was the kind of car that naturally fit the harsh, lawless world that Mad Max would later portray. The Falcon XB GT was never a mass-produced vehicle. Between 1973 and 1976, fewer than 2,000 GT coupes were built. That means it was already a relatively rare car before Hollywood, or more accurately, Australian cinema turned it into a legend. The transformation itself was carried out by Melbourne-based customizers at Graphics International under the supervision of Mad Max art director John Dowding. Every modification served a purpose. Nothing was added randomly. The team carefully crafted a vehicle that looked capable of chasing criminals across a collapsing world. The body received dramatic changes. A large rear spoiler appeared on the roof, another spoiler was added to the trunk, and wide wheel arch flares gave the car a much more muscular appearance. The front end was completely reworked with a distinctive aerodynamic nose inspired by the Concorde aircraft. One of the most memorable details was the set of 8 side exhaust pipes running along the vehicle. They looked intimidating, but only 2 of them actually functioned. The rest were there purely for visual impact. The wheels were swapped out for Sunraysia rims, measuring 15 by 8 inches in the front and a massive 15 by 10 inches in the rear. Combined with the widened arches, the stance became absolutely perfect. Then, there was the paint. Dowding described it as black on black, using gloss black across the main body and matte black accents to create contrast. The effect made the car look sinister and almost military in nature. Even standing still, it looked dangerous. And of course, there was the supercharger. That giant blower sticking through the hood became one of the most recognizable automotive features ever shown in a movie. It looked outrageous, and that was exactly the point. Audiences instantly believed this machine possessed unimaginable power. But here's the funny part. In the first Mad Max film, the famous supercharger didn't actually do anything. It was a non-functional prop. In the movie, the mechanic character Barry proudly claims the car can produce 600 horsepower at the wheels when the blower is engaged. It sounds incredible. The reality was much simpler. The blower was there purely for appearance. By the time production moved on to the Road Warrior, things changed. The supercharger was made functional. However, even then, some of the dramatic scenes relied on clever filmmaking techniques. To create the illusion of the blower switching on and off while moving, the vehicle was placed on a low-loader trailer. The engine could then be started or stopped while the car appeared to be racing down the road. Movie magic did the rest. But while the blower may have involved some cinematic tricks, the engine beneath it was absolutely real. Under the hood sat Ford's legendary 351 cubic inch Cleveland V8. And this is where the story becomes far more interesting than many people realize. The 351 Cleveland first arrived for the 1970 model year. It was named after Ford's Cleveland engine plant in Brook Park, Ohio, where it was manufactured. At the time, Ford already offered the 351 Windsor, which had entered production a couple of years earlier. Even though both engines shared the same displacement, they were very different designs. The Cleveland wasn't simply an updated Windsor, it was essentially built from scratch. The block design differed, the heads were different, and very few parts could be swapped between the two engines. What truly set the Cleveland apart was its cylinder head design. Drawing inspiration from the Boss 302 and Ford's 385 series big blocks, engineers equipped the engine with canted valves and large intake ports that allowed exceptional airflow. At higher RPMs, the engine could breathe remarkably well. Then came the Boss 351 version in 1971, featuring forged aluminum pistons, 4-bolt main caps, and a more aggressive camshaft. Output climbed to approximately 330 horsepower. For its time, that was serious performance. The Cleveland quickly earned a reputation as Ford's high-revving performance weapon. It found its way into vehicles like the Mustang Mach-1, the Mercury Cougar XR7, and the Ford Grand Torino. Drivers loved its ability to pull hard through the RPM range and deliver the kind of excitement muscle car enthusiasts craved. Unfortunately, its time was short. Despite its potential, the 351 Cleveland only remained in production from 1970 through 1974. 4 years. That was all it got. The reason had little to do with the engine itself. The real problem was the changing automotive landscape. New emissions regulations were becoming increasingly strict. Compression ratios were lowered. Performance numbers began to fall. Then, the oil crisis of 1973 dealt another major blow to the muscle car world. The golden age wasn't fading naturally. It was being squeezed from multiple directions at once. That's what makes the Australian Falcon XB GT so important. While American performance cars were being restricted, Australia operated under a different set of rules. The country wasn't dealing with the same emissions requirements that were reshaping the American market. As a result, the Cleveland engine survived there in a much healthier form. The Australian Spec XB GT still produced around 300 horsepower, and approximately 380 pound-feet of torque. Power was sent through a 4-speed top-loader manual transmission. Performance remained impressive, with 0 to 60 miles per hour taking roughly 6.8 seconds and top speed reaching around 135 miles per hour. For a production car in 1973, those numbers were genuinely impressive. To understand how significant that was, compare it to what was happening in America at the same time. Many famous muscle cars had already seen their performance reduced dramatically. Engines that once dominated the streets were producing far less power than they had only a few years earlier. Yet in Australia, Ford was still building aggressive V8 coupes that retained much of their original character. The XB GT wasn't just fast on paper, either. It proved itself on the racetrack. The platform competed successfully in Australian touring car racing, and Alan Moffat famously drove XB GT Falcons to championship victories in 1976 and 1977. This wasn't merely a stylish coupe, it was a proven performance machine. So when George Miller and Byron Kennedy selected the Falcon for Mad Max, they weren't simply choosing a car that looked intimidating. They were choosing a vehicle that already symbolized the final stand of traditional V8 performance. And that's where everything starts to come together. Within the story of Mad Max, the Pursuit Special is presented as the ultimate police interceptor. Civilization is collapsing. Resources are becoming scarce. Law and order are hanging by a thread. Yet the main Force Patrol chooses to create this extraordinary machine. What do they build? Not a computer-controlled vehicle. Not something packed with electronic systems. Instead, they build a brutally simple V8 coupe powered by displacement, fuel, and mechanical force. Everything about it reflects the old-school muscle car philosophy. That wasn't accidental. George Miller understood what muscle cars represented. They were machines built around a straightforward idea: more power, more speed, and a direct connection between driver and machine. The 351 Cleveland fit that philosophy perfectly. By the time Mad Max reached theaters in 1979, the engine was already gone from production. The world that created it had changed. Emissions regulations had changed. Fuel prices had changed. The entire culture surrounding muscle cars had changed. So when audiences watched that black Falcon blasting across the Australian landscape with a supercharger rising from the hood, they weren't just looking at a cool movie car. They were looking at something that had already become history. The movie even hints at this through the vehicle's nickname, the last of the V8 Interceptors. That title carries more meaning than many viewers realize. The car is essentially a ghost from a vanished era. Its journey through the films reinforces that idea perfectly. Decades later, fans are still dedicating time, money, and passion to keeping its image alive. The Mad Max Interceptor was never just transportation. It became a symbol. It represented a moment in automotive history when performance was raw, mechanical, and unapologetic. The 351 Cleveland V8 represented some of Ford's finest engineering, and somehow its most memorable appearance didn't happen in a Mustang or a Torino. Instead, it found immortality inside a black Australian Falcon racing across a desolate highway at the edge of civilization. That's why the Interceptor remains so powerful today. It's more than a movie prop. It's a rolling monument to the muscle car era itself, a machine that refused to go quietly, even after the world that created it had disappeared.